The temp nurse's hands trembled. That was what Dr. Hargrove saw when Rachel Torres pushed through the electric doors of Oak Creek Memorial at 6:02 a.m. on a Monday in October. Trembling hands. A civilian scrub top with a coffee stain on the left shoulder. An ID badge clipped crooked. Just another rotating temp, here to fill a staffing gap, forgettable by Friday. He did not see the faded navy jacket draped over her locker, the one she always kept facing backward so the insignia couldn't be read from the hallway. He did not see the unit patch sewn into the lining, the same patch that had been stitched into the sleeves of warriors at Sangin, men and women who'd held lives together in dust storms and darkness. He did not see her forearms when she changed into scrubs, where thin white lines mapped stories she'd never tell. He did not see that the trembling in her hands was not fear. It was restraint. Rachel moved through the cardiac unit with the kind of invisibility only discipline could create. She kept her eyes down during morning rounds. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then in fragments. "Yes, doctor." "Right away. I'll notify the attending." She made herself small. She made herself forgettable. This was the only way to disappear in plain sight, and she'd learned long ago that disappearing was survival. The antiseptic smell of the hospital, bleach and sterile saline and something chemical she couldn't name, hit her the same way it always did. For a fraction of a second, her mind wasn't in Raleigh anymore. It was in a field surgical unit, canvas walls, the smell of diesel and blood. She blinked. Measured breath. The moment passed. She was here. She was present. She was just a nurse. At 7:15 a.m., Admiral James Whitmore was admitted to room for 12 for routine cardiac observation. Arrhythmia detected during his annual physical. Nothing acute, the cardiologist said. Just monitoring. Precautionary. Whitmore was 71, still military straight in his bearing, the kind of man who didn't ask questions of his doctors the way he did of his sailors. He lay in the hospital bed in dress blues, a choice that made Rachel's chest tight, and waited for the placement that was standard protocol. Dr. Hargrove decided to observe this one himself. The temporary nurse. The one with the shaky hands and the unremarkable scrubs. He wanted to see how she'd handle it. Basic for insertion. A test of competence that everyone passed. That everyone should pass. Rachel entered the room with the 4-kit, 18-gauge angiocath needle, tourniquet, alcohol swab, tape. She introduced herself to Admiral Whitmore with a nod of respect and moved to his left arm with what looked like hesitation. Hargrove watched from the doorway, arms folded. Already cataloguing failures. But then something shifted. The moment the tourniquet tightened, Rachel's entire body changed. Her jaw set. Her shoulders squared 2 inches higher. Her breathing synchronized with the pulse point she was palpating. Her hands moved on their own, and they did not tremble. They moved with the kind of precision that belonged to someone who'd threaded fours through the veins of bleeding soldiers while artillery rounds hammered the earth outside a tent. One motion. Clean insertion. The needle slid in on the first attempt, the catheter secured, blood return confirmed, saline running clear. 23 seconds. That was all it took. Admiral Whitmore's eyes opened slightly wider. There was a recognition there, something ancient and military that lived below words. He watched her hands as she taped the line. "Well done, petty officer," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement of fact. Rachel's hand stilled. She did not look at him. "Thank you, sir." 8 words. But something had shifted in her voice, too. Something that lived deeper than civility. She finished securing the tape and turned from the room without another word. Hargrove watched her go. His eyes narrowed. He'd seen that precision before. In surgeons. In certain trauma nurses who didn't work public hospitals. There was something off about this temp. Something she wasn't telling. That evening, the cardiac unit's break room smelled like burnt coffee and microwave popcorn. Rachel sat alone at the corner table with her phone, reading a text she shouldn't have answered. Marcus's sister again. We miss you. Please come for Thanksgiving. She deleted it. Deleted the 17 texts before it. Deleted her location history. Deleted everything except the screensaver photo of Marcus in dress whites, pinned to her jacket lining where no one could see it, where it couldn't betray her to a civilian life that was supposed to be safe. The break room door opened. 3 nurses from the unit entered, saw Rachel, exchanged a glance, and turned directly back out through the other door. Rachel had learned not to flinch at this. She'd learned not to register it. But she felt the weight of it every time, the intuition that something about her was wrong, off, dangerous. People could sense it the way animals sense a predator in grass. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at 2:34 p.m. the next day. Rachel was reviewing the monitor strips for room for 47, where Mrs. Chen had been admitted with symptomatic bradycardia. Heart rate in the 40s. Hargrove had ordered atropine, the standard protocol. It was correct protocol. It was also wrong. The code came 9 minutes after the atropine infusion. Rachel was in the hallway when the alarm erupted. She was moving before the second beep, pushing into room for 47 where Mrs. Chen's daughter stood against the wall with her hand over her mouth and Hargrove was already shouting orders. Charge to 200. Get me a crash cart. Where's the damn crash cart? The monitor showed what Rachel had known it would show. Asystole. Flat line. Atropine had dropped Mrs. Chen's blood pressure into the basement. The elderly woman's heart had simply stopped. We need a second for, Rachel said. Her voice was quiet. Not deferential. Just factual. And we should consider a pacemaker. Transcutaneous if we can't get transvenous in the next 60 seconds. Hargrove's head snapped toward her. Did I ask for your opinion, Ms. Torres? No, doctor. Then do your job. Second 4. He turned back to the monitor, barking orders to the resident. Prepare for transvenous pacing. And get cardiology down here. Now. Rachel was already moving. The 4 went in with practiced efficiency, second try, not ideal, but there. She was reaching for the pacing leads when Hargrove grabbed her wrist. His voice dropped to something worse than a shout. Something cold. You don't think I know my protocols, Ms. Torres? You don't think I understand bradycardia? I've been running cardiac codes for 19 years while you were, where? Where exactly were you getting your experience? The room had gone silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that belonged to moments that wouldn't be forgotten. Rachel's eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Not louder. Just deeper. Different. Like something that had been sleeping was opening one eye. I've seen what happens when people follow orders instead of their training, doctor. She pulled her arm free and continued securing the pacing leads. Mrs. Chen's baseline rhythm indicates she doesn't respond to atropine. She needs a pacemaker. Not orders. Protocol based on this patient's presentation. Hargrove's face went the color of old brick. Get her out of here. Now. Someone get this temp out of my code. But Mrs. Chen's heart rate was climbing. 60. 70. Stable rhythm. The transcutaneous pacemaker was holding. Rachel stepped back from the bed. She set the 4 kit on the tray table and met Hargrove's eyes one more time. She didn't flinch. She didn't lower her gaze. She acknowledged nothing, not the humiliation, not the rage vibrating off him, not the 12 years of military medical training that had just revealed itself in a hospital room in Raleigh, North Carolina. She walked toward the door. Ms. Torres, Admiral Whitmore's voice called from his room across the hall. She could hear it from where she stood. A word, if you have a moment. Hargrove stepped into her path. You're done here. You understand? We're calling the temp agency. You don't come back tomorrow. You don't finish this assignment. Rachel paused. The rage in his voice wasn't professional. It was personal. It was the sound of a man whose certainty had been cracked by a moment he couldn't explain away. She said nothing. She simply stepped around him and continued into the hallway where Admiral Whitmore was waiting, one weathered hand extended toward his full line, his eyes asking questions that didn't have civilian answers. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and institutional surrender. Rachel pushed through the door at 6:16 a.m., her scrub still damp from pre-shift hand washing, and chose a seat at the far end of the table where the morning light wouldn't catch the tremor she wouldn't let her hands show anyway. 7 staff members occupied the space, 2 nurses, a respiratory therapist, a tech, and 3 nursing assistants. Conversations hummed in low clusters. Rachel opened her lunch container. Microwaved chicken. Rice. The kind of meal that took 5 minutes to prepare and tasted like quiet desperation. The respiratory therapist, Marcus Chen's colleague from the evening shift, was the first to move. He stood without looking at her, his chair scraping against tile-like fingernails on a chalkboard. Moving to the other side, he announced to no one in particular. One of the nurses, Jennifer, who'd been kind during Rachel's first week, hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before rising. That hesitation was worse than the movement. It meant she wanted to stay. It meant she was choosing not to. The others followed like dominoes, their lunch containers and coffee cups migrating across the room in a synchronized retreat that was almost choreographed in its cruelty. Within 90 seconds, Rachel sat alone at a table built for 10. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head, a sound like insects trapped in plastic, and the conversations on the far side of the room resumed with the deliberate loudness of people pretending not to notice what they'd just done. Someone laughed, too loud, too bright. Rachel cut her chicken into smaller pieces than necessary. Her jaw was locked tight enough to crack teeth. She chewed mechanically, each swallow an act of will, while the isolation pressed against her like pressure at depth. She'd been alone in Sangin with nothing but a radio and the sound of dust storms. She'd been alone in the water off Camp Lejeune at midnight, breathing through a tube, waiting for the signal to surface. But this silence felt different. This was erasure by committee. The door to the unit board was made of cork and announcements, and by Friday morning, it had become a gallows. Rachel arrived at 5:52 a.m., an hour before her shift, and saw it immediately, her name printed in black ink on white paper, centered on the board like a tombstone. Formal reprimand. Rachel Torres. Insubordination. Failure to respect chain of command. Questioning physician orders in patient care areas. Effective immediately, probationary status. The document was laminated. Professional. It looked like it had been prepared in advance, like Hargrove had known exactly what words would hurt most and had them typed up while she was still operating under the assumption that competence mattered more than hierarchy. Staff began arriving at 6:15. One by one, they read the notice. Rachel watched from the computer terminal, her fingers frozen above the keyboard, pretending to chart while 12 people processed her public execution. A medical tech whistled low under his breath. One of the newer nurses, fresh out of school, still naive enough to think nursing was about patients, asked Rachel, "Did you actually argue with Hargrove during a code?" Rachel didn't answer. The question itself was the humiliation. The answer didn't matter. She'd already been convicted. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 6:56 a.m., coffee in hand, and stationed himself at the nurse's station where he could watch her face as she approached the board to remove her write-up. She forced herself to walk straight, to move like someone who wasn't burning from the inside out. She read the laminated paper twice, once to absorb the words, once to make sure they were real. Her right eye wanted to tear. She would not let it. She steadied her breathing the way she'd steadied it before insertions in the dark, before underwater breathing, before anything that required composure as a survival tactic. One tear escaped anyway, sliding down her right cheek so slowly she could feel each millimeter of its descent. She wiped it without breaking rhythm, turned to face Hargrove, and spoke clearly enough for the entire unit to hear, "I've seen what happens when people follow orders instead of their training. People die." Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he'd won. People also get fired, temp. The words landed like a weight at the bottom of a well. Rachel returned the write-up to the board. She couldn't remove it, it wasn't hers to remove, and stepped back into the current of the day, where everyone continued moving forward as if they hadn't just watched something be buried. She needed air. She needed space that wasn't poisoned by institutional betrayal. Instead, she had a shift. 16 hours of this. 16 hours of isolation wearing the mask of employment. That afternoon, standing at Marcus's grave in Raleigh Memorial Park, the rain fell like accusation. The headstone was granite, dark grey, with his name carved in letters so precise they looked military. Marcus Edward Torres. 1989 to 2023, beloved husband. Beloved son. There was room for more on the stone, space where Rachel's name would eventually sit, though they'd never discussed it. They hadn't discussed much of anything in the last 4 years, not really. She'd come home from Sangin changed in ways she couldn't name, and he'd loved her anyway, or tried to, or at least he'd stayed. He'd stayed until the aneurysm took him one Tuesday morning while she was at work, and suddenly his staying didn't matter anymore because there was no more staying left to do. She held her nursing badge in shaking hands, actually shaking, because there was no one here to see, no one here to maintain the composure that had become the only armor she owned. The badge had her picture on it, her real name, and the title registered nurse beneath her face, like she was someone other than who she actually was. The laminate was starting to crack at the corner. She'd been holding it too tight. "I tried to be normal for you," she whispered to the headstone. The rain hammered down harder, percussion on her shoulders, on the grass, on the granite that would keep him longer than she'd kept him alive. "I tried to disappear, to just be a nurse, to stop being what I was. But I failed at that too." The words came out smaller than she wanted them to, thin as thread, dissolving into the rain the moment they left her mouth. Marcus couldn't hear them. Marcus hadn't been able to hear her for 7 months now. But she needed to say them anyway, needed to tell him that his sacrifice, his patience with her PTSD, her night terrors, her hands that sometimes didn't know they weren't holding a rifle, hadn't saved her. She was still drowning. She was just drowning slower, and now she was drowning at Oak Creek Memorial in a hospital gown that wasn't hers, working under a name that was half a lie, and nobody knew who she actually was. Nobody would ever know. That was the contract she'd made with her own reinvention. She stayed at the grave for 43 minutes, rain soaking through her jacket, turning her dark hair black as water. Then she drove back to the hospital because she still had a shift to finish, because bills didn't care about dignity, because walking away from this job meant walking away from the last thread of the normal life she'd been trying to weave for Marcus's memory. Admiral Whitmore arrived on Thursday at 2:14 p.m., transferred from Walter Reed on orders that didn't quite say routine but didn't quite say urgent either. 71 years old, Naval Academy class of 1972, decorated with the kind of quiet authority that made the whole unit's energy shift the moment he entered. His chest pain had resolved. His EKG was normal. But his cardiologist in Washington wanted overnight observation anyway, which meant Rachel was assigned to his care, which meant she was about to be tested in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. She took his vitals with efficient precision, BP 128/82, heart rate 71, O2 sat 98% on room air, and charted everything correctly, everything by protocol, everything that would keep her beneath Hargrove's microscope. The Admiral watched her work with the kind of attention that meant he was seeing her as more than a caregiver. "You move like military," he said conversationally, the way a man says it when he's 95% sure and asking the 5% question just to confirm. Rachel's hands didn't falter. She adjusted the forestand with the same economical motion she'd used to strip and maintain rifles. "I move like someone who's done this before, sir." She hung his navy dress jacket carefully in the closet, her fingers brushing against the material, olive drab, service dress, the uniform of a different era, and her touch lingered on the fabric because it was the closest she'd come all day to anything that felt like home. The Admiral noticed. Of course he noticed. The Admiral was the kind of man who noticed everything, which meant he was also the kind of man who would eventually ask questions Rachel couldn't answer while wearing scrubs. At 1:06 a.m. on Friday morning, the monitor alarm pulled Rachel from the station charting. Admiral Whitmore's systolic had dropped from 110 to 89 in 4 minutes. She moved to his room without calling it in first, something protocol would call a violation, something survival called instinct. His lips were already tinged with the pale blue of insufficient oxygen. His neck veins bulged like rope, and when she assessed his chest, she heard it immediately, muffled heart sounds, the kind of distant echo that meant fluid was compressing the chambers. Pulsus paradoxus when he tried to breathe. Beck's triad complete. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid that had settled in his pericardium at Walter Reed had accumulated, and now it was crushing his heart. She paged the code team. She paged Dr. Hargrove. The Admiral gasped her name, not nurse, not help, but her actual name, which meant he'd read her badge and parsed something from the combination of letters that made her identity matter to him. Can't breathe, he managed, and his fingers reached for her scrubs like a drowning man reaching for anything solid. The ER was 12 minutes away by ambulance. The Admiral had 4. The combat medic from the ER rotation burst through the door exactly when she needed him to, when the monitors were screaming and Hargrove's voice was crackling orders through the overhead speaker about waiting for the attending physician, about not proceeding without authorization, about respecting the chain of command. The medic, Davis, according to his name tag, locked eyes with Rachel, and in that single moment of recognition, he saw something in her face that made his own expression shift like a door opening. He saw her hands hovering over the crash cart with a kind of precision that didn't come from 6 months of nursing. He saw her eyes moving across the Admiral's chest like they were reading a map she'd already memorized. "Where did you learn to cut like that?" he whispered, and the question wasn't about nursing. It was about the other life, the one she wore underneath the scrubs, the one that made her fingers move with the muscle memory of battlefield medicine instead of hospital protocol. Admiral Whitmore arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 3:44 p.m. Thursday afternoon, transferred from Walter Reed in a private car driven by a junior aide who carried nothing but a single manila folder marked observation only. His chest pain had resolved somewhere over Route 64. The EKG showed no acute changes. His troponin was normal. By every measure that appeared on a standard workup, the Admiral was stable, a 67-year-old man with a resolved episode, scheduled for 48 hours of monitoring before discharge. What the monitors couldn't see was already gathering inside his chest. Pericardial fluid. Building silently. Accumulating in the narrow space between his heart muscle and the pericardium that contained it, pressing down with the patience of a python, waiting for the moment when pressure would collapse what pressure had begun. Rachel was assigned to his care by shift rotation, a random assignment that no one questioned because a routine observation bed required only routine competence. She hung his bag at 4:15 p.m., normal saline drip, nothing remarkable, and noted his history in the computer system with the flat efficiency of someone who had done this 5,000 times before. The Admiral's eyes followed her as she worked. "You move like someone who's done this under fire," he said quietly. Rachel didn't look up from the monitor. "Just hospital experience, sir." She didn't tell him that hospital had a different meaning when the hospital was a field tent in Sangin with mortar rounds walking across the compound. The Admiral nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she wasn't saying, and then he settled into the bed and closed his eyes like a man who trusted the medical system and the nurses inside it, which meant he trusted Rachel Torres whether or not he knew who she actually was. By 10:24 p.m., Rachel's shift had rotated to nights. She did rounds at midnight and found the Admiral sleeping peacefully, his oxygen saturation at 98%, his heart rate in the mid-60s, his blood pressure solid at 118/76. Everything normal. Everything quiet. Everything wrong. The human eye cannot see inside a pericardium. The human hand cannot feel fluid pressing against the myocardium through skin and rib cage. The monitors showed what they were programmed to show: heart rate, oxygen, blood pressure, and they reported no emergency because no emergency protocol exists for the slow, invisible suffocation of a man's own heart. Rachel checked his vitals again at 1:33 a.m. because something in her training made her move to his bedside unbidden. Call it muscle memory. Call it the tactical awareness that had kept her alive in places where medics died for failing to listen to instinct. She found him restless now, his sleep fractured. His finger oxygen saturation was dropping. 97, 96. 95, she logged it and said nothing because no protocol existed that required action until a number dropped below 90, and she was learning very quickly at Oak Creek Memorial that protocols mattered more than eyes. At 1:58 a.m., the Admiral woke gasping. His hand clutched his chest. His eyes were the size of coins. Rachel was there in 3 steps, her hand on his shoulder, her voice dropping into the command register that Dr. Hargrove had spent 3 days trying to crush out of her. "What's happening?" His voice was breathless. Literally breathless. His oxygen saturation was dropping now on 92, 90, 88, and his heart rate was climbing 110, 118, 125, and he was clutching his chest like he was trying to hold his ribs together against pressure that was building from the inside out. Rachel pressed the call button once and started talking into the intercom with the steady precision of someone ordering a strike. "Code blue, bed for 12, cardiac tamponade suspected, need the crash cart and an ultrasound machine now." By the time the code team arrived at 2:02 a.m., the Admiral's pressure had collapsed to 65/42 and his oxygen saturation was 82% and dropping. The residents froze. The attending paused. The nurses looked to each other the way people look when they're waiting for someone to tell them what to do next, and nobody wanted to be the one who moved without permission. Rachel moved anyway. Her hands didn't shake. That wasn't the part that people remembered later, it was the silence that came with them. She was already pulling the ultrasound machine into position at 2:03 a.m. when Dr. Hargrove's voice came through the overhead speaker, tinny and distant from wherever he was driving. "This is Dr. Hargrove. I have override. Stand down. Nobody touches that patient until I arrive. That is a direct order." Rachel's jaw clenched once. One single muscle tightening in her face, and then it released, and she turned to the ultrasound monitor. The transducer found the subxiphoid window, the space below the breastbone where the heart lies closest to the surface, and she began moving it with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this procedure not in the clean, fluorescent quiet of an American hospital but in the dust and noise of field tents under fire. The image resolved on the screen. Massive pericardial effusion. Dark. Fluid-filled. Crushing the right atrium. The Admiral's pressure was 58/36 now. His oxygen was 78. His heart rate was too fast to count. He was dying. A voice spoke beside her. "Quiet. Steady. I can assist." Petty Officer Davis. The combat medic who'd seen something in Rachel's hands 2 days ago and had said nothing to anyone except maybe to himself, turning it over in his mind like a shell casing he'd picked up off the ground. He was already prepping the sterile field without waiting for permission, and Rachel understood in that moment that there was a version of the world where you asked for permission and a version where you simply moved, and the difference between them was often whether people lived or died. She reached for the pericardiocentesis kit, a 14-gauge needle, a catheter, tubing, a collection bag. The procedure existed in every medical textbook and in none of the places where Rachel had actually learned it, because she'd learned it in a field tent with rounds coming in and a man bleeding into his own chest and hands that had become instruments of pure necessity. "Torres, step away from that patient immediately." Hargrove's voice was louder now. Angrier. Desperate. "I am en route. Wait for my arrival." The Admiral's eyes rolled back. His pressure dropped to 55/30. His oxygen was 74. Rachel's hands trembled once, one single involuntary moment where the weight of every decision she'd made to hide, to disappear, to play small enough that nobody would notice her, came rushing back like a pressure wave. The PTSD that had driven her from the Navy was still there, still crouched in her chest like a living thing, still waking her at 3:38 a.m. screaming Marcus's name, still reminding her that the hands that saved lives had also failed the one person she'd loved most. For 1 second, one single moment, she let it almost break her. Davis said quietly, "I saw you work in Kandahar, Senior Chief. I was in a different unit, but everyone knew your hands." His voice was steady as surgical steel. "This man needs those hands." Rachel took one measured breath. One tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact with the monitor. "Then he'll have them." She inserted the needle at a 30-degree angle beneath the xiphoid process, her hands moving on their own now, muscle memory taking over, the tactical awareness that had survived 2 tours through Sangin and 4 years in a civilian hospital bed with her late husband slowly dying beside her. The ultrasound guided the needle tip into the pericardial space. She advanced slowly. Carefully. The way you moved through a minefield. And when the needle tip reached the fluid, dark blood-tinged fluid rushed back through the catheter into the collection bag, 50 cubic centimeters, 100 cubic centimeters, 150 cubic centimeters. The Admiral's pressure rose like someone turning a valve. 70, 85. 95, his oxygen came up. 82, 88. 92, his heart rate began to slow. His eyes fluttered open and found her face, and for a moment the code room held its breath, because even the people who didn't know what they'd just witnessed understood that they'd just seen something that belonged to a different world than this one. The Admiral's hand found hers. His grip was weak, but his voice was clear. "Valkyrie," he whispered. Rachel's face went white. Her hands froze on the catheter. The entire room suddenly felt smaller. "I know that call sign," he continued, his voice thin as paper. "I know where it comes from. I authorized your Bronze Star in 2012. Rachel stood very still. She didn't look at Davis. She didn't look at the code team. She was still holding a catheter inside a man's chest, draining fluid that would have killed him in minutes, and the Admiral had just named her in a way that went back to a world she'd built a nursing career trying to escape. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 2:31 a.m. to find the Admiral stable. Breathing. Pink. Conscious. His pressure was 105/68. His oxygen was 96%. His heart rate was 88 and regular, and the pericardiocentesis had been completed with 280 cubic centimeters of fluid drained, and the Admiral was already being transferred to ICU, where he would spend the next 8 hours in intensive observation, his fluid status monitored, his heart rhythms tracked, his life hanging in a different kind of balance now, the kind that required machines and medications and time, not a needle and the muscle memory of a woman who was supposed to be just a temporary nurse. Rachel was documenting the procedure at the bedside when Hargrove walked into the ICU bay. His expression was stone. His eyes locked on hers. "You directly violated my order." Rachel closed the chart. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She looked at him with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I saved his life." Hargrove turned to address the crowd that had gathered outside the glass. The entire ICU staff had stopped working to watch the Admiral settle into his bed, to watch the woman in scrubs who'd saved him, to watch the attending physician whose authority had just been overridden by someone he'd spent 3 days humiliating. His voice came out cold and even. "Everyone back to your stations. Now." By 3:56 a.m. the hallways were empty and the monitors were beeping their soft electronic songs, and Hargrove was in his office making calls, first to Margaret Chen, the board member who'd signed off on his billing protocol in 2021, then to Raymond Pierce, the CFO who'd benefited from certain creative accounting arrangements Hargrove had facilitated, then to the temp agency with allegations of credential fraud and practicing beyond scope and unauthorized procedures and insubordination. The words he used were carefully chosen. The accusations were meticulously crafted. He had favors to call in and a reputation to protect, and a woman who'd just revealed herself to be something far more dangerous than a temporary nurse ever could be. What he didn't have was any idea that the man in ICU bed 412 had already seen her call sign. That the Admiral was awake and lucid at 3:44 a.m., pressing his nurse button and asking for a phone. That a call was already being made to a number that didn't exist in normal government directories. That by the time Hargrove made his last call asking the temp agency to suspend Rachel's credentials, something very much larger than Oak Creek Memorial's institutional politics had already been set in motion. The Admiral rested his hand on his bandaged chest and smiled at the ceiling. "Valkyrie just came home," he said to the empty room. "And nobody saw it coming." At 5:45 a.m., the Admiral's monitors showed sinus rhythm, steady, strong, alive. Rachel had charted the vitals herself, her handwriting precise and unflinching as she documented the pericardiocentesis, the drainage of fluid, the exact measurement of blood retrieved, 847 milliliters. The numbers told the story her mouth never would. 53 minutes after saving his life, she sat alone in the break room with a cold cup of coffee and the weight of secrecy pressing down like a surgical retractor, holding everything open where it should stay closed. The door swung inward. Not a colleague. Not a doctor. Hospital Security Chief Mike Patterson stood in the threshold with his radio clipped to his belt, and beside him was HR Director Chen, her tablet clutched like a weapon. "Ms. Torres." Chen's voice had no warmth in it. "We need you to come with us." Rachel set down her pen. She didn't ask questions. She didn't stand quickly or move with any indication of resistance. Muscle memory taught her that compliance was a tool, that moving too fast could be interpreted as threat, that silence was safer than words. She rose and followed them down the corridor where night shift staff pretended not to watch, where fluorescent lights cast everything in that pale institutional white that made even truth look sterile. The conference room held an investigator, a man in a grey suit with the kind of face that had conducted 1,000 interviews. His briefcase sat open on the table, filled with printed pages, highlighted sections, damning documentation. Dr. Hargrove stood near the window, his arms crossed. He looked like a man who had already won. "Ms. Torres, I'm Special Investigator Crane with Sterling Compliance Review." The man gestured to a chair. "We've received serious allegations regarding credential misrepresentation, unauthorized medical procedures, and falsification of your employment application." His voice moved with the cadence of someone reading from a script he'd perfected. "Your temporary staffing agency has suspended your assignment pending a full background investigation. Dr. Hargrove has documented multiple instances of insubordination and scope of practice violations." Rachel Saturday. Her hands folded on the table. They didn't shake. Control was the only thing that belonged to her anymore. Hargrove slid a paper across the table, her temp agency application, pages marked with red circles and angry annotations. "Your employment history lists nursing experience at 3 different facilities over 6 years. I've contacted all 3. None of them have any record of you. Not one." His smile was the smile of a man who had made phone calls at 4 a.m. to 3 board members, who had activated favors he'd been saving, who had called the temp agency directly and whispered words like fraud and liability and lawsuit. "The dates don't even align. You claim you were working in Charlotte when you listed San Diego on your secondary application. It was true. All of it." Rachel had created a civilian nursing history because the alternative was admitting where those 6 years had gone. She'd spent them in Sangin Valley with blood on her hands and ghosts in her peripheral vision. She'd spent them learning to cut into chests and clamp arteries and make decisions about who lived and who was already beyond saving. Admitting that meant admitting the PTSD, the nightmares at 0300 hours, the way her hands knew exactly how to perform emergency surgery because they'd done it 47 times in a combat zone. Admitting it meant admitting she'd broken. "Do you have documentation to support your claimed experience?" Crane's pen hovered over his notepad. Rachel's voice came out steady as a metronome. "No." One tear escaped. She wiped it before it could fall, her index finger catching the moisture with the same precise efficiency she'd used to position the needle in Admiral Whitmore's pericardium. "I don't." Hargrove leaned back. He had her. A temp nurse with a fabricated work history, caught lying to the hospital, exposed to an external investigator, suspended by her agency. By end of business, his documentation would be forwarded to the state nursing board. By next week, her license would be under review. By next month, it might be gone entirely. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and nodded at Crane. The investigator didn't need her anymore. "You're terminated effective immediately," Chen said. "Security will escort you to retrieve your personal items. You are not to return to this facility without explicit written permission from hospital administration." Mike Patterson appeared in the doorway as if he'd never left. Rachel stood and followed him to her locker in the nurse's lounge, the locker where she'd hung her scrubs, where she'd stored the single photo she kept, Marcus in his army service uniform, taken the year before the IED had made him into a flag folded in her hands. She pulled out her cardigan, her bag, the few items that constituted her life at Oak Creek Memorial. Mike brought her a cardboard box, the kind used for supplies, the kind that held nothing but transition and endings. At 7:03 a.m., 5 hours and 3 minutes after she'd drained a Navy admiral's pericardium and saved his life, Rachel Torres walked through Oak Creek Memorial's lobby carrying that box. Her nursing badge was in her hand now, the laminated photo showing a woman who looked almost normal, almost like she belonged in civilian life, almost like she wasn't holding the scars of 3 combat tours in a hospital uniform. The morning staff arriving for day shift watched from their stations. No one spoke. No one moved. The room went so quiet you could hear the hydraulic hiss of the automatic doors opening. Mike held the door. His jaw was clenched tight. "I don't know what happened in there, but that didn't feel right. You saved that Admiral last night. I heard the staff talking about it when I came on shift. You did something nobody else could do." Rachel stopped. She looked at this older veteran, someone whose eyes had seen things too, someone who understood that some burdens couldn't be shared. "Thank you for that, Mike. Where will you go?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The rain had started, light and steady, the kind of rain that felt like a judgment. She crossed the parking lot to her car, set the cardboard box on the passenger seat, and sat motionless for 7 minutes, counting them the way she'd been trained, breathing the way combat medicine had taught her. Then she turned the key and drove north toward Raleigh Memorial Gardens. By noon, Rachel stood at Marcus's grave. The rain had intensified, hammering the grass, soaking through her cardigan and the navy jacket beneath it, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, embroidered in thread so old it looked like it had been there for decades. SEAL Team 3. Sangin, 2012. The call sign Valkyrie stitched in letters too small for anyone to notice unless they were looking for it. Unless they knew what to look for. She knelt in the mud. The stone read, Marcus James Torres, 1987 to 2018. Loving husband, fallen warrior, forever honored. Her voice came out broken in a way her hands never would. "I tried to be normal for you. I tried to disappear. I tried to come home and just be a wife and forget what I'd seen, what I'd done." She pressed her forehead against the wet stone. "But I failed at that too. I failed at being quiet. I failed at being small. And now I've failed at everything, even the one job I was trying to do right." The rain hammered harder. "I'm sorry I couldn't be the person who came home." She stayed there for 19 minutes, kneeling in the mud, holding her nursing badge in shaking hands, believing that this was how her story ended, not with vindication or recognition, but with disappearance so complete that even her own sacrifice would be erased. The hospital would have no record of who she was. The state board would see a terminated nurse with a fabricated history. Dr. Hargrove would have won by noon. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had no idea what was already in motion. The hospital board convened at 9:36 a.m. Saturday morning, and Dr. Hargrove entered the room wearing the confidence of a man who'd already won. He'd made his calls, triggered the investigation, cleared his threats from the premises. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres was gone. By this afternoon, her record would be officially tainted, her temp license suspended, her career in tathing in the rearview. He took his seat at the mahogany table, 3 board members nodding at him subtly, allies he'd cultivated over cocktails and golf outings. Then Admiral Whitmore's daughter stood. "My father regained consciousness an hour ago," she said, her voice steady and measured. His first coherent request was for Senior Chief Torres. By name. He asked why she wasn't here. The room's temperature shifted. Hargrove's jaw tightened. CEO Mendez, who'd been reviewing files, looked up. The Admiral's daughter continued, he wants to know why the woman who drained the fluid from his pericardium at 2:56 a.m., the woman whose hands kept him alive for 40 minutes until transport, is being terminated for saving his life. The door opened. A trauma nurse named Davis stepped forward, trembling slightly, holding a personnel file so worn the edges were soft. She'd been rotating through cardiac for the morning and had pulled Rachel's complete military record from sealed files. Her hands shook as she read aloud, deployments to Kandahar and Sangin. 3 combat rotations. Advanced Tactical Medicine Certification. Field Surgical Training. Combat Lifesaver Instructor. Each line landed like a bullet. Hargrove's breathing became visible, sharp, shallow, the breath of a man watching his narrative collapse. The nurse continued, 2 Bronze Stars. Navy Commendation Medal with Valor. A Purple Heart. She looked up from the file, her eyes wet. Dr. Hargrove, she wasn't a temp nurse. She was a senior chief. The board members leaned back. Hargrove's hands went flat on the table, pressing down as if gravity had suddenly increased. Then the door opened again. A man in Navy dress blues entered, a Navy SEAL team leader, Commander Whitmore, face like weathered stone, presence like a tank idling in a garage, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He'd flown in overnight from Norfolk, hadn't showered, didn't care. He walked directly to the center of the room and began to speak with the precision of someone used to being obeyed without question. "I'm Commander James Whitmore, Team 3 Charlie Platoon," he said quietly. "I served with Senior Chief Torres in Sangin. I'm here to confirm her decorations, her rank, and her value to anyone willing to listen." He pulled out a leather folder, and the room went dead silent. Bronze Star for actions under fire in 2009. 2nd Bronze Star for tactical medical intervention that saved 7 Marines in 2011. Navy Commendation Medal with Valor for establishing forward casualty protocols that reduced mortality by 34%. He paused. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. And a Purple Heart. Shrapnel from an IED. Sangin Valley. 2012, he looked directly at Hargrove. That woman performed under conditions that would have broken most people. And you fired her for competence. Admiral Whitmore's nurse had brought him to the boardroom in a wheelchair, still weak but conscious, his face the color of old ivory but his eyes sharp as surgical steel. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced something small and faded, a unit patch, the insignia worn nearly white by 18 years of hiding. His voice was rough from disuse but carried authority. "I wore this patch in 1987. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. 36 years later, my daughter shows me this patch was sewn into the lining of Rachel's jacket. Same insignia. Same battalion. Different war. She carried the legacy of our unit while pretending to be nobody." Hargrove's face flushed a deep crimson. He tried to speak. She violated direct orders. She performed a procedure without, but Commander Morrison, the board's military liaison, interrupted with a voice like winter. "She saved your Admiral's life when you missed the diagnosis entirely. You then weaponized institutional authority to destroy her because she made you look incompetent." The words landed precisely. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed. The room's air seemed to thicken around him. CEO Mendez pulled her laptop forward, her expression hardening into something carved from stone. "Dr. Hargrove," she said quietly, "I've spent the last 2 hours reviewing your personnel actions. 17 formal complaints filed against staff in 2 years. 12 against nurses who questioned your orders. 8 of those nurses no longer work at Oak Creek." She looked up. "All terminated within weeks of raising concerns about your patient care protocols." The rhythm of her words was like a heartbeat flat line. 3 of those nurses filed complaints about delayed responses to patient deterioration. 1 patient died. Silence swallowed the room. Commander Morrison leaned forward. "I've cross-referenced hospital records with state medical board complaints. A pattern emerges, Dr. Hargrove. A clear, documented pattern of retaliation against staff who demonstrated clinical competence beyond your own. Hargrove's voice rose, desperation creeping in like water through a crack. This is character assassination. I've served this hospital for 23 years. I've trained hundreds of residents. But the words rang hollow now, empty as a deflated lung. The board members who'd been his allies sat back. One, Williams, wouldn't meet his eyes. The door opened one final time. It was Mike, the security guard, the same man who'd handed Rachel her box of belongings at 7:03 a.m. that morning. He carried an identical cardboard box. He walked with the deliberate pace of someone delivering a verdict, and he set the box down directly in front of Dr. Hargrove with a soft thud that sounded like an ending. The box tumbled slightly, and the movement made Hargrove flinch. Mike's voice was quiet, quieter than whispers, the kind of quiet that carries more weight than screaming. Dr. Hargrove, I believe you know the way out. The board voted 7-0 for immediate termination. The security escort to his car was already being arranged. By Monday, the state medical board would receive a formal complaint. By Tuesday, Hargrove's license would be flagged for review. By month's end, the only position he could secure was teaching CPR at Raleigh Community College for minimum wage, standing in front of people who'd never heard his name, who didn't know he'd once controlled an entire hospital unit with threats and institutional power. He taught them chest compressions and rescue breathing, the basics, the skills for saving lives instead of destroying them. 3 weeks later, Rachel stood at Marcus's grave in the afternoon rain. But this time, she wore navy dress whites, the uniform she'd sworn 18 months ago that she'd never wear again. The rain fell on her shoulders like a benediction. Beside her stood Admiral Whitmore, leaning on a cane but alive, breathing, his heart beating because her hands had been steady when everyone else's were shaking. The Admiral's daughter stood 3 paces back, finally understanding where her father's benefactor had come from, finally understanding what sacrifice looked like when it wore scrubs. Your husband would be proud, the Admiral said. His voice was the color of bourbon and cedar wood. Rachel reached out and pressed her palm against the cool granite headstone. Marcus Chen, beloved husband, teacher, light. 1987 to 2023. I broke after Sangin, Rachel said quietly. I thought hiding was healing. Thought if I could just disappear, become nobody, stop being Valkyrie, maybe I could be normal again. The rain accelerated, hammering the ground like applause. I failed. The Admiral set his cane down and placed a hand on her shoulder. Healing takes courage, Senior Chief. So does coming back. His words landed with the weight of command authority, but gentler. You didn't fail. You just took a longer route home. That afternoon, Oak Creek Memorial's auditorium filled with staff and Navy personnel and press cameras that would capture the moment everything realigned. CEO Mendez stood at a podium of light wood and polished steel, her face composed but proud. It is my honor to announce that Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres has accepted the position of Director of Emergency Medicine and Trauma Services, effective immediately. She will oversee emergency protocols, trauma response, and staff training across all departments. The room erupted. Not polite applause, genuine, roaring, the kind of applause that comes when people realize they've witnessed something shift in the world's axis. Rachel stepped forward in her dress whites, the uniform fitting her like a second skin, and accepted the credentials Admiral Whitmore pinned to her chest. The patch on his jacket gleamed silver in the auditorium lights, the same insignia she'd carried in her jacket lining, the same legacy, now visible. In the front row sat Marcus's sister, weeping openly, finally understanding where Rachel had vanished to, why she'd become so hollow, why healing had taken this long. In the back, 12 former staff members who'd participated in Hargrove's isolation campaign watched with shame and the beginning of respect they hadn't offered before. The combat medic Davis saluted her formally, a full, precise salute, hand to forehead, acknowledgement of rank and honor. Rachel returned it slowly, deliberately, her arm moving like an honor guard's. After the ceremony, Rachel stood in her new office, a corner room on the 3rd floor with windows overlooking the parking lot where she'd carried out her belongings in a cardboard box just 3 weeks prior. She pulled the faded unit patch from her pocket, the patch she'd sewn into her jacket lining years ago, the patch she'd carried through everything, through Sangin, through the loss of Marcus, through pretending to be nobody. She pinned it to her office wall beside Marcus's photograph, the one taken at their wedding, her in civilian clothes, him in dress blues, both of them smiling at a future that would be shorter than either of them knew. CEO Mendez found her there, standing in the late afternoon light. "Why emergency medicine?" the CEO asked. Rachel's answer was simple and absolute, because that's where people need Valkyrie most. That's where the ones no one else can save come through the doors. That's where skill matters more than politics. As Rachel left that evening, she passed the cardiac unit where her nightmare had begun just 3 weeks prior. The night shift staff stood as she walked past, a formal salute, the gesture of respect they denied her when she was just another temp nurse. She returned the salute with quiet dignity, her spine straight, her eyes forward, the woman they'd tried to erase finally visible. The final frame would show Rachel leading trauma rounds the next morning, her voice clear and commanding, teaching young nurses the procedures that saved lives, mentoring them with competence and respect no longer hidden. The same hands that had been mocked as inexperienced were now teaching the next generation. The same mind that had been called dangerous was now shaping protocol. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were, subscribe and share Rachel's story. Comment below, what would you have done in her position?